Welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Linda Zerilli. I'm Lisa Wadeen, the director of 3CT. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay, great. Linda Zerilli is the Charles E. Merriam Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science and the College. She was the 2010-16 faculty director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, where she continues in her capacity as a leading scholar and teacher in the field. Zerilli is the author of numerous works, including Signifying Woman, Cornell University Press, 1994, Feminism and the Abyss of Freedom, University of Chicago Press, 2005, A Democratic Theory of Judgment, University of Chicago Press, 2016, and the recently published A Democratic Theory of Truth, hot off the press, University of Chicago as well, 2025. And the book is available for purchase in the back, and it is absolutely stunning, or at least the penultimate copy was absolutely stunning, so I can't imagine what this one is like. Zerilli has written articles on subjects ranging across feminist thought, the politics of language, of aesthetics, democratic theory, and continental philosophy. She's been a Fulbright Fellow, a two-time member of the Institute for Advanced Study, and the Stanford Humanities Center Fellow. In 2016, Linda Zerilli won the University Faculty Award for Excellence in Graduate Teaching and Mentoring, and I see a number of her students in the audience today. She has served on the Executive Committee of Political Theory and the advisory boards of the American Political Science Review, Philosophy and Rhetoric, Constellations, and Culture Theory and Critique. She is a dazzling intellect and a dear, dear friend. On behalf of 3CT, please welcome Linda Zerilli.
Critique is needed in our post-truth times. We live in a world where the political norm is to lie, be indifferent to facts, and appeal to irrational emotions. Consequently, many critics argue that we must recommit ourselves to objectivity, rational discourse, and truthfulness in politics, recognize the subjective nature of opinions, and hold political actors accountable to rigorous fact-checking standards. These demands raise my guiding question. What concept of truth is presupposed in the post-truth debate? According to the received conception of truth, the part played by the citizen subject in determining the existence or value of truth is given in the structure of truth itself. Here is how Michel Foucault parses this view of truth. Quote, "The truth is sufficient unto itself for making its own law, and why? Quite simply because the coercive force of truth resides within truth itself. In the search for and manifestation of truth, what constrains me, what determines my role, what calls on me to do this or that, what obliges me in the procedure of the manifestation of the truth, is the structure of truth itself. It is truth itself, and that is all. I submit myself to what is true because it is true. In the state of post-truth, it is said that various sinister interests converge to occlude or distort the difference between truth and falsity, leaving citizens unbound to truth's otherwise inherent guiding force. But what if the coercive force of truth did not depend on truth alone, as critics assume, but on us? In his later work, Foucault questions the received view that truth determines its own regime, makes the law, and obliges me. He introduces the idea of historically situated games of truth on the one hand and regimes of truth on the other. Foucault grants that the epistemological criteria of truth belong to the game. However, he disputes that once we agree that something is true, we are bound to the regime. That is, to the practical consequences or obligations that flow from the "it is true." Quote, "There is always a certain assertion that does not belong exactly to the realm of the true and the false. That is rather a sort of commitment, a sort of profession. If it is true, then I will submit. It is true, therefore I submit. It is true, therefore I am bound." But this "therefore" he adds is not a logical therefore. It cannot rest on any self-evidence, nor is it univocal, moreover. Denying that the subject's submission to truth belongs to the game Foucault was not reduced to truth to power, as critics who denounce him as an apologist for post-truth hold. Instead, argues Daniele Lorenzini, Foucault argues that the game has no intrinsic coercive force. It cannot compel those who play it to submit to the practical consequences that follow from accepting the epistemic validity of X. The distinction between game and regime, between epistemic acceptance and practical submission, significantly affects how we think about the democratic problem of truth. It helps explain why citizens with vastly different political views can agree on the facts. It is not always a problem of lies and fake news, but draw contrasting, if not incommensurable, conclusions for their public lives. They might accept that something is true, for example, that Joe Biden won the 2020 presidential election, but refuse the practical consequences, endorsing Biden as the legitimate president. It provokes questions about the public conditions under which democratic citizens bind themselves to truth and become what Foucault calls allothergic subjects. A regime of truth points to the part played by the citizen subject and the specific political context in which one might or might not bind oneself to any game of truth. Indeed, what interests Foucault is how binding oneself to truth underwrites what he calls the government of men by the truth. Quote, why in a society like ours is there such a deep bond between the exercise of power and obligation for individuals to become themselves essential actors in the procedures of manifestation of the truth, in the procedures of allothergy needed by power? In other words, how is the affirmation of truth, and not just its denial, as post-truth critics hold, connected to political rule? For Foucault, power has no intrinsic legitimacy, and any form of power is non-necessary. It could be otherwise. Instead of assuming that we should bind ourselves to something simply because it is true, we should both contest the idea that there is no truth and problematize the intrinsic value of truth for democratic politics. Shifting the accent from it is true to the force we accord truth, we can critically examine how subjects have gradually bound themselves in and through the manifestation of truth to different forms of power. We can question how games and regimes of truth might bind us not only to politics as freedom, but also to what Hannah Arendt calls politics as rule, a historically tenacious idea of what must be the case for all socio-political life that finds support in the superhistorical conception of truth that has nothing to do with us. Quote, every claim in the sphere of human affairs to an absolute truth, whose validity needs no support from the side of opinion, strikes at the very root of all politics, writes Arendt. For her, the despotic character of truth resides in the idea that it has nothing to do with us in the specific sense of citizen opinion, the free public exchange of which is the hallmark of all political thinking. Arendt's insistence that anti-political truth has no place in the public realm needs to be squared with her recognition that without accepted factual truths, there would be no public realm and no opinions to exchange. For her, shared factual truths form the scaffolding of the public realm, but the compelling force of truth should be excluded from what she calls the wholly persuasive nature of political debate. In my book, I show that this familiar Arendtian containment strategy must be squared with Foucault's claim that the coercive force of truth lies not in the game itself, but in the regime, the therefore by which the subject submits herself to the practical consequences that follow from the it is true. For now, however, I want to focus on Arendt's admission that factual truths, being contingent, are vulnerable. She writes, in other words, factual truth is no more self-evident than opinion, and opinion holders find it relatively easy to discredit factual truth as just another opinion. Notwithstanding its supposedly coercive force, factual truth is at grave risk of being manipulated out of the world, giving rise to what Arendt describes as, quote, the lying world order. In her well-known account, 20th century totalitarianism was such a world. It invented what she calls the modern political lie.
By contrast with the traditional political lie, the modern lie aims not to mislead or falsify reality, but to recreate it. Quote, fascist propaganda was not satisfied with lying, but deliberately proposed to transform its lies into reality. For such a fabrication of a lying reality, no one was prepared. Any argumentation with fascists is senseless. It is as though one were to debate with a potential murderer as to whether his future victim were dead or alive, completely forgetting that man can kill and that the murderer, by killing the person in question, could promptly provide proof of the correctness of his statement. With this transformation, the modern political lie introduces what Arendt calls a mutation into the history of the lie. Quote, to some extent, fascism has added a new variation to the old art of lying, the most devilish variation, that of lying the truth. The mutation introduced by the modern political lie does more than transform the lie into reality. Its political power goes beyond the creation of a fictitious world. The more intractable problem associated with the new modern art of lying the truth, Arendt writes, is a peculiar kind of cynicism, an absolute refusal to believe in the truth of anything, no matter how well this truth may be established. In other words, the result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that lies will now be accepted as truth and the truth be defamed as lies, but that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world, and the category of truth versus falsehood is among the mental means to that end, is being destroyed. With that destruction comes deep skepticism about all truth claims. Quote, if everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather nobody believes anything any longer. Indeed, she writes, the ideal subject of totalitarianism is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exists. The modern political lie is not restricted to terror-ruled regimes. In texts written after the origins of totalitarianism, Arendt examined the corrosive work of the modern political lie in contemporary democratic governments. In a scathing reading of the Pentagon Papers, she argues that brazen defactualization, reality-denying image-making, and the destruction of the distinction between true and false is a standing threat to modern democracies. The modern lie is a complex reality-creating and reality-destroying phenomenon that employs truth claims not to dissimulate truth, that is, conceal, hide, or distort, but instead to undermine the basis of distinguishing between true and false, and with it, that factual truth exists. Arendt links the modern lie to the reality-creating ability to act. According to Arendt, the lie changes the record of history, not as a falsehood that negates a truth, but as a perlocutionary act of speech that, like political action in her view, changes something in the world. However, the corrosive character of the modern lie does not rest solely on the abilities of the exceptional liar. Important though these might be for establishing a charismatic public presence, a following of true believers, or access to the highest and most secretive workings of government, we will misjudge the contemporary problem of lying in politics if we remain focused on the liar. Enthralled by the virtuosity of the liar, we lose track of the lie. It is the lie as boundless action that has an inherent tendency to force open all limitations and cut across all boundaries, writes Arendt. It is not, for example, Donald J. Trump, the masterful liar, but the Trump lies, acting into a medium where every reaction becomes a chain reaction and where every process is the cause of new processes. In its capacity as boundless action, cut loose from the intentions and control of the liar, the lie takes on what Arendt calls an active, aggressive quality that alters reality beyond any individual's control. I'd be happy to talk about examples later. I argue that Arendt's description of the modern lie aptly describes our predicament today. First, unlike the traditional lie that concerns particular facts and serves specific political ends, the modern lie is directed at facts that everyone knows. It deceives not only specific individuals, but everyone in society. including the liars themselves. And it's aimed not at particular facts, but at the entire framework of factuality itself. Second, and relatedly, if the problem is not only that democratic citizens take for true what is false, or vice versa, but that increasingly no one believes anything anymore, we cannot fact-check our way out of post-truth. We should recognize the real problem as worldly disorientation and the disintegration of citizens' credulity regarding the very existence of facts and factual truth. These go hand in hand, I argue, with ideas of objective truth, for which citizen opinions are merely subjective, hence cognitively worthless, and the dramatic shrinkage of public spaces where opinions can be formed and exchanged. The erosion of belief such that nothing can count as evidence is a familiar trope of modern skepticism. The skeptic puts forth a hypothesis that can account for all the data on which those beliefs rest, but is incompatible with the beliefs themselves. Famously dramatized by Descartes, our ordinary beliefs can be explained by the hypotheses that we are dreaming or that a malicious demon is manipulating what we take as real. We could be a brain in a vat for all we know. Key to this form of skepticism is that no possible sensory evidence could distinguish between states in which we are dreaming and are awake, whether a demon is at work or not, within the modern Western philosophical tradition's view of knowledge as certainty. The states are empirically equivalent. Accordingly, how can we know the news we read is not fake news? How do we know the faces on the web are those of real people and not deep fakes? How do we know our favorite celebrities' posts are authentic when AI and bots hijack social media sites? The entirety of our existence could be a computer simulation. The malicious demon, also dear to conspiracy theorists, could be the deep state, the liberal media, MAGA Republicans, democratic socialism, or corporate capitalism, depending on your political point of view. That fact-checked evidence meant to prove otherwise is increasingly disregarded is unsurprising. Radical skepticism arises when no possible data tell apart the skeptical hypothesis and the beliefs the skeptic is attacking. There is no possible counter-evidence to assuage doubt. Arendt took Descartes' external world skepticism to express in extreme terms the broader problem of subjectivism and worldlessness that characterize the modern age. The politically corrosive character of Cartesian doubt arose not as a response to intellectual debates, but to changes wrought by capitalism, science, and technology. Like Arendt, I connect the modern lie to radical skepticism by departing from a purely philosophical account to describe the loss of faith in the world-giving power of the senses and in common sense, the sixth sense that fits plural sense experiences into a shared world. In my account, the corrosive and all-encompassing form of doubt about a shared reality that Arendt calls Cartesian is not refutable as common sense philosophical realists like G.E. Moore claimed, nor is it a timeless and ongoing temptation that belongs to the human condition, as Stanley Cavell, claiming to channel Wittgenstein, described it. It is instead a profoundly troubling but also understandable response to contingent historical changes in material and political reality that eventually create the conditions for the modern lie and its evisceration of the belief that the distinction between true and false so much as exists. Describing radical skepticism as doubting, quote, that such a thing as truth exists at all, Arendt seems to name the problem we call post-truth. But this is an illusion. For her, the problem of factual truth is not, as it were, the loss of truth. Instead, it is a broader problem of modern subjectivism and worldlessness, compounded by the consumerism and loneliness of mass capitalist society. It is a problem of the constitution and maintenance of the common world through the exchange of citizen opinions that is bypassed by calls to reinstate the received idea of objective truth. Although the modern lie in democratic regimes does not attain the totalitarian total substitution of lies for factual truth, Arendt recognized, as should we, that loneliness, isolation, social media silos, and a vastly attenuated public spaces have generated growing cynicism regarding factuality in liberal democratic capitalist mass societies. Any serious discussion of post-truth should begin there, not with nostalgia for a supposedly lost truth. Arendt's response to the modern lie's threat to democratic politics is not to double down on the received conception of objective truth, as did many individuals of her generation, like most post-truth critics today. From Plato to the present, this is the idea of truth as binary, either a proposition corresponds to reality or not, and of opinion as a deficient truth claim. Truth describes phenomena as they are independently of how they appear to us. Truth bypasses any admixture of human subjectivity, in James Conan's apt phrase. Indeed, he writes, anything properly termed an appearance to a subject is ipso facto, not a glimpse of reality. This gives rise to the following fateful formula for specifying what it means for a property to be objective. Objective knowledge of the world must involve knowledge of properties of the world that in no way depend upon the effects such properties typically have upon cognizing subjects. This fateful view of objectivity and truth has decisive consequences for democratic politics. It binds true discourse to science, cognitive expertise, and epistemic competence, and not least, it erodes citizens' ordinary view of opinion. As no exercise of human subjectivity can produce objective knowledge, citizen opinion is ipso facto merely subjective. How the world appears to each of us can never bring the shared world into view. We need a new problematization of truth. Let's begin with Foucault's account of the problematization of truth in ancient Greece. For him, a discourse of truth cannot be reduced to the reality of things of which it speaks. The question of what is real is not the same as what is true. The fact that the sky is blue will never be able to account for the fact that I say the sky is blue, writes Foucault. He does not deny that it is because the sky is blue that it is true to say the sky is blue. He denies that a blue sky reality accounts for truth claims about it. Reality cannot explain the historical emergence of true discourses. Truth is a supplement, something added to reality that has no existence apart from subjects who affirm it. Distinguishing between what is real and what is true, Foucault examines the surprising emergence of true discourse in domains originally devoid of truth, including politics. His approach resonates with Hannah Arendt's genealogical account of truth and the Greek polis. Arendt disputes that politics has always been organized around the pursuit of absolute truth. She describes the rise of the Platonic Academy as a new but anti-political space of philosophical and intellectual freedom that pitted the few against the many, the quest for singular truth against plural opinion, which lives on in debates about academic freedom and the role of experts in democratic institutions. Each thinker genealogically examines the historical origins and eventual entanglement of truth and politics in ways essential for rethinking post-truth debates today. Discerning a new problematization of truth in 5th century Athens, Foucault identifies a shift in the understanding of parrhesia, or the freedom to speak frankly. As an institutional system of equality, democracy cannot determine who should have the right and the aptitude to tell the truth. But not everyone who speaks frankly tells the truth. There can be, quote, bad parrhesia. Since parrhesia is given even to the worst citizens, he remarks, isn't it a fact that this parrhesia becomes a danger for the city and the democracy itself, since the overwhelming influence of bad orators leads necessarily to tyranny? The problem of democracy and bad parrhesia sounds to us rather familiar, writes Foucault. Indeed, it captures the pessimistic mood of the current debate over post-truth and democratic erosion. Such familiarity can conceal the historical moment of discovery when political parrhesia of the agora became a problem, the philosophical parrhesia of the Platonic Academy rose in its place, and the free public exchange of opinions came to be seen as opposed to telling the truth. To restore the commitment to true discourse is to return democracy to its supposedly real origin in a timeless truth, which has been lost to an excess of bad parrhesia. Yet Foucault is clear, quote, "Nothing is more inconsistent than a political regime that is indifferent to truth, but nothing is more dangerous than a political system that claims to lay down the truth. This is the genuine danger that the post-truth debate conceals from view. Democracy has historically accommodated competing claims to truth and the right of ignorant and even irresponsible speakers to exercise the freedom to spread falsehoods as an instrument of power. That belongs to parrhesia and to isagoria, the equal right to speak in public. Nevertheless, citizens must be in a position to know who is telling the truth, to forestall the formation of an authoritarian regime whose claim to absolute truth brokers no debate." Foucault's study of parrhesia articulates a crucial distinction between thinking about the problem of truth as being able to determine whether I think it's like, what's going to give out first, my voice or the cars? It's not going to be the cars. Foucault's study of parrhesia articulates a crucial distinction between thinking about the problem of truth as being able to determine whether validity claims are veridical on the one hand, and being able to discern who can tell the truth and why telling the truth matters for a democracy on the other. These related but different abilities represent what he calls two sides, two major aspects of the great Greek problematization of truth. The side that Foucault calls the analytics of truth concerns itself with ensuring a statement is true and its reasoning is correct. And the side he calls the tradition of the question focuses on, quote, the importance for individuals and the city of telling the truth and of recognizing which people are able to tell the truth. It is the side concerned with the possibilities for truth-telling rather than correct reasoning that Foucault identifies as the foundation of the critical tradition of philosophy in our own society. And I'll be explaining why. Taking up these two problematizations of truth, I read the post-truth debate as centered squarely on the analytics of truth. That is, on correct reasoning and veridicality, where the force of truth lies in the truth itself. It is only a matter of citizens remaining cognitively alert to truth's presence, tracking truth. The first problematization of truth circles around issues associated with the traditional lie, such as exposing falsehoods, errors, and deliberate dissimulation. Accordingly, it focuses on fact-checking and knowledge practices that generate unbiased information and the cognitive ability to process it objectively. It does not address the problems associated with the modern lie. As a form of action, we have seen that the modern lie targets not particular facts that can be checked, but the entire framework of factuality. It leaves the liar's intentions behind, setting in motion a series of unintentional processes and realities that persist even after the lie has been exposed. Furthermore, correct reasoning can operate without citizens recognizing truth as politically significant. The subject might fact-check a claim, agree or disagree on its epistemic validity, yet refuse to draw the relevant pragmatic consequences. For truth to have force, there must be a game and a regime of truth, which has everything to do with us and the political context in which games of truth are played. This includes authoritarian or totalitarian regimes and liberal democratic ones characterized by loneliness, worldlessness, and a lifeless public realm. Responses to the parrhesia crisis have run the gamut of epistocratic arguments from Plato to the present, which seek to limit the political rights of citizens and entrust political rule to an educated class of citizens based on their putative cognitive superiority. A democracy that relinquished civic political participation to such authority as its legitimating principle would no longer qualify as a democracy. Consequently, epistocratic arguments in modern liberal democracies are typically clothed in the technocratic language of the administrative state, which serves as a fierce object of fierce criticism for both Arendt and Foucault. Epistocratic arguments in no way solve the crisis of parrhesia. How shall we know who's to tell the truth, and why should citizens trust experts? Focusing not on the analytics of truth, but on the truth teller and truth telling as the root of the critical tradition, Foucault's account of the crisis is not a brief for epistocracy, but an attempt to forestall arguments for its necessity. Such arguments take hold when average citizens are not trusted to make the right decisions or even to decide who is capable. Consequently, they are called upon to give up their right to an opinion with public significance. As the 1920s debate between Walter Lippmann and John Dewey showed, once cognitive competence, or the capacity for correct reasoning, becomes the criterion for meaningful participation in public affairs, the ordinary citizen's opinion, no matter how informed, will never rise to satisfy technocratic criteria of knowledge. Thus, technocracy reduces citizen opinion to the merely subjective and risks morphing into authoritarianism, for which truth is no longer contingent but necessary and fixed. Arendt and Foucault view bad parrhesia as a problem that inheres in democracy but cannot be eradicated without destroying democracy or solved by epistemic means. They raise the issue of truth as something other than an epistemic problem of the criteria for true statements and correct reasoning. I've argued that epistocratic arguments and their refutation have defined no small part of the debate over democratic erosion and post-truth. They circle better and worse ways of limiting bad parrhesia. Whatever side one takes, we risk devising a cure worse than the disease. How might we leave the terms of the discussion behind and build out the second great tradition that Foucault names the critical tradition of the question in ways that can facilitate democratic critique and truth-telling today? Reframing the debate about post-truth through the critical tradition and the problem of truth-telling rather than correct reasoning, I advance a democratic theory of truth and critique in a realistic spirit, bringing Arendt and Foucault into conversation with ordinary language philosophy. I take my cue from Cora Diamond's book, The Realistic Spirit, Wittgenstein, Philosophy and the Mind, which develops Wittgenstein's realistic position in contrast to the surprising affinity between the anti-realist and realist idea that some underlying regularity must secure the proper relationship of our judgments to reality. This affinity, writes Diamond, can be found in the shared style of answer to questions of the general type. Where is the reality which must guide us here? Where is the reality to which our mode of thought must be responsible? The realist and anti-realist, she writes, accept the same pair of alternatives. Either there is a logical reality independent of and external to our modes of thought and expression, or there is not. And the logical structures of our thought and expression are fundamentally arbitrary. Either there is something where we are both looking for a reality, or there is not, and we are without objective standards. That is what they both think. Are we not looking for reality in the wrong place? Look somewhere else. That is what we can hear in Wittgenstein's later philosophy. Look where you do not think there would be any reason for looking, writes Diamond. This places our ordinary non-metaphysical methods of distinguishing the real and the unreal, which the realist counsels us to mistrust and the anti-realist embraces at the expense of any claim to objectivity. Wittgenstein teaches that reality is not to be found external to or beyond our effective modes of expression, but in them. And he shows those modes are not arbitrary but objective. As Conant writes, we need to be able to regard our modes of sensibility as involving operations of subjectivity and as affording us genuine glimpses of the world. Put otherwise, genuine human knowledge practices are subject-dependent, not subjective. Wittgenstein makes visible the picture that holds us captive, the fantasy that leads both realists and anti-realists to think our linguistic practices depend for their stability on a prior reality whose truth has nothing to do with us. He seeks to redirect our attention from looking beyond our life with words to the practices themselves. In a famous, difficult, but clarifying passage of Philosophical Investigations, he responds to an imaginary interlocutor thus: "So you were saying that human agreement decides what is true and what is false? It is what human beings say that is true and false, and they agree in the language they use. That is not agreement in opinions, but in form of life." Wittgenstein's claim is not that whatever human beings say is true, that would be subjectivism, but that whatever is true is spoken by us. It's subject dependent. As Foucault told us, truth is a supplement added to reality that originates in our ordinary life with language and in non-epistemic forms of agreement that Wittgenstein calls certainty. Critics who denounce post-truth as the death of democracy and those who grudgingly accept it as the price for democratic pluralism entangle us further in the fantasy about what truth and objectivity require. They share the same surprising affinity of the realist and the anti-realist. Either there is an independent reality and we need to keep looking for it, or there is none and our fate is post-truth. Both make objective reality dependent on something external to what we say and do. This narrow conception of objectivity, writes Alice Crary, is based on an impossible abstraction requirement that excludes our affective propensities. Post-truth critics look for reality in the wrong place by bypassing human subjective responses to the world. Everything we need for democratic truth-telling is already available in our public acting and speaking. Realistic critique and the transformative possibilities of truth-telling involve learning to see what has gone unnoticed because of its familiarity. One is unable to notice something because it is right before our eyes, writes Wittgenstein. We take things for granted and fail to appreciate their strangeness and contingency. To take things in this way is not realistic, for it deflects the difficulty of reality with sedimented concepts: animal rights, altruism, women's work, political rule. Bringing these things to our attention, lighting them up, to speak with Nancy Bauer, is a practice of realistic critique. Once again, adopting the realistic spirit is not easy. As Hannah Pitkin parses Wittgenstein, sometimes it's not easy to see the obvious. Sometimes we have to learn to see, and the learning can be a slow and difficult process. It's almost a matter of forming new habits of thought, unquote. Foucault, too, is deeply attuned to the critical resources of the ordinary. Quote, "We have known for a long time that the role of philosophy is not to discover what is concealed, but rather to make visible what precisely is visible, which is to say, to make appear what is so close, so immediate, so intimately connected with ourselves that we cannot perceive it," unquote. The model for such critical thinking, he goes on, is Anglo-American ordinary language philosophy, which seeks to tell us that language never fails nor shows anything. Rather, language, like relations of power, is played. It's a little bit in this direction that I've tried to work. If Foucault has a method, it is this. Approaching truth as an ordinary language game, he develops a realistic critique that makes visible precisely what is visible but remains unseen. How might a new picture of the democratic problem of truth be developed from the realistic critique of Arendt, Foucault, and Wittgenstein? The first step is to see whether what everyone accepts as a genuine problem is not just a captivating picture of how things must be. Post-truth is a problem arising from a particular way of thinking about truth. It should be clear by now that this is in no way to say that fake news, rampant lies, and alternative facts are not real problems for democracy. However, we will recognize the sources and solutions to these problems if we remain in the grip of the picture of post-truth. Rather than lead us back to what is already in plain view with Arendt, worldlessness, loneliness, and attenuated public spaces, or with Foucault, the part each of us plays in giving force to receive truth, this picture tempts us to look for the real causes elsewhere, in ideological discourse that conceals and distorts truth, in the subjectivism of citizen opinion, or in the easygoing relativism of democratic pluralism. My argument follows from a wager. Post-truth is not, in the first place, a problem of truth, be it false belief, false consciousness, or ideological distortion. It is a problem of what David Owen calls aspectival capture, being held captive by a picture or perspective as the only possible picture or perspective open to one. We are captive to a system of judgments, themselves neither true nor false, that provides a framework to count what can be true or false and become part of the common world. Truth-telling belongs to the critical condition that enlivens our capacity to see that other perspectives on the world are possible. Truth-telling begins with a counterintuitive idea that truth does not always set us free. Understood as part of the critical tradition of parrhesia, truth-telling is not just stating any truth that belongs to any game. Like these cars are loud. That's true, but it's not parrhesia. It requires the courage to say what those in power do not want to hear, and our fellow citizens tend to deny. Both Arendt and Foucault are agreed on these points. For Arendt, under normal circumstances, truth-telling, by contrast with lying, does not seek to change the world. It merely tells what is, so it's not action. However, truth-telling becomes political, she argues, in context of rampant public mendacity. Quote, where everybody lies about everything of importance, the truth-teller has begun to act. He has engaged himself in political business. For the unlikely event that he survives, he has made a start to changing the world. Like lying, then, truth-telling as action exhibits the inaugural capacity to start something new. Foucault, too, sees truth-telling as a risky but potentially transformative act that confronts received forms of power. For him, however, the truth that parrhesia manifests is an ethical and political force that challenges how the parrhesia's interlocutor lives, while also affirming the speaker's own critical mode of being, her growing awareness that there is no automatic, therefore I submit, that follows upon the epistemic agreement that belongs to a game of truth. The vast machinery of fact-checking that has arisen in response to post-truth might appear to be our contemporary form of truth-telling. I've argued, however, that fact-checking and related knowledge practices bypass the fundamental issue of power posed by truth, namely, as Lorenzini puts it, the multiple ways in which we give truth the right to tell us what to do and how to live. We should problematize the you have to of the truth and become aware that no therefore goes without saying or is automatically decided for us by the truth itself, however decisively we may accept the criterion outcome of the game. Recognizing all the therefores that silently govern our conduct, we can agree that something is true, yet refuse to be governed like that and at that cost, as Foucault describes critique. This is why it is not enough to track truth, as post-truth critics hold. Just because something is revealed as false and something else shown to be true does not mean that we should give it force, allow it to govern our conduct. As an example, consider the medical and psychiatric game of gender dysphoria that Lorenzini discusses. Foucault, he argues, does not want to say, this game of truth is wrong, either because you do not really suffer from gender dysphoria or because the entire game is saturated with heteronormative assumptions about what gender is. That would be to assume that if it were true, you should not resist. The question is whether to give the truth force and power over one's conduct. There are at least 3 options open to you in the case of a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. You could accept the diagnosis as true and submit to the treatment, accept the diagnosis and refuse the treatment because you refuse to be categorized as mentally ill, or refuse the diagnosis and the treatment. There is even a 4th, if less evident option, argues Lorenzini. You could reject the game but accept the regime. In other words, you could refuse the diagnosis, the truth of the diagnosis, the truth of the game, and receive the treatment because you desire sex bodily change for whatever reason. In any game of truth, there is always more than one option because the game does not have force in itself. Foucault invites us to recognize our role in the government of men by truth. He aims not to deny truth, but to animate awareness of how we give the truth the right to tell us what to do and how to live. The world built around our submission to receive truths could be otherwise. As for Arendt, her critique of the submission to truth as the basis for political life is grounded in a key insight. We have the world in common, only insofar as we see it from different perspectives, and form opinions and judgments that take these into account. The common world is a political achievement, not an epistemic contract and not an ontological fact. Speaking to others elevates features of the public world into salience, calls attention to what remains unseen from any individual standpoint, and makes visible what is in plain view. Because it must be continually recreated and found, our common world can also be lost. Lost is not truth, but the world where any humanely possible idea of truth can dwell. What could the realistic spirit be in contemporary democratic political theory? If post-truth is a picture that holds us captive, how might we loosen its grip on our political thinking to facilitate better comprehension of our current predicament and our imaginative capacity to face and resist it? A realistic democratic theory of truth begins in the ordinary with what we do and say in ordinary language. There the truths relevant to politics will be found because they do depend on us. Thank you. Thanks for your patience. That was a little long. I kept trying to cut, but I was unsuccessful. Well, I was successful because otherwise I'd still be talking. But I'm happy to take questions or comments, things you want to add maybe.
And feel free to tell me just to buy the book because the answer is there. Do I need to turn it on?
It's on. It's
Okay. About the difference between the real and the true. It sounds as if you're saying that reality has no agenda, has no agency, and it is only us who make propositions like this is true, this is false, are the ones who are capable of articulating accounts of reality. Like when we utter the phrase, Trump is a liar. Is that the essence of your distinction between the real and the true? That the true is an articulation of an account or claim about what's real, because the real is not only incapable of articulating, but is indifferent to what we take to be real, because the real isn't even capable of indifference, because the real is sort of like it, even more insensate than artificial intelligence. And then as a little follow-up, in a sense, are the books that you cite and your own book examples, in any interesting sense, of very big citizen opinions? Is that their ontological status of the books that you believe are real, including your own? Are those examples of citizen opinion?
Okay, thanks a lot for your questions. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not making any claims about what the real thing says or whatever. I'm really just, I mean, I'm following up on an insight of Foucault's, but it's also in Arendt's work too. I mean, she's very clear that the real and the true are two different things. It's just a basic philosophical point. But Foucault really, kind of drills down into this. And what he wants to get at, which I found helpful for understanding the post-truth debate, or the assumption that democratic politics should be governed by truth, is that, for example, politics was not always a matter of truth. Like, in other words, there was true discourses arise about certain things, certain human practices, and not about others. So Foucault, traces things on, for example, marriage and stuff, where he says, well, there wasn't any true discourse. People were just sort of engaging in these things. But all of a sudden, this moral discourse arises, this true discourse arises about it. So he's interested in the question of, why do we start making things that we're already doing, or that are part of our reality, into a matter of the true and the false. So that's one question. And I think that that's an interesting question for understanding Arendt's point that politics did not always have to do with truth. There's a point at which politics was seen as being concerned with truth, but that doesn't belong to the activity of politics itself originally. Your second question, yeah, this is my opinion. I'm a citizen, so I mean, I'm defending citizen opinions. So yeah, you could read it that way.
I mean, it's a little jokey, but
yeah, but it is.
Opinion is. It's basically like a very short book.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There you go.
Hi, I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm excited to read the book. And it's also possible that this is in the book as well. But I have a question of mostly of clarification, because it seems that there are like potentially three routes in this like problematization of the post-truth debate, and one, or maybe a mix of these three. One might be to take on the maybe more Foucault challenge of challenging the particular games of truth or the analytics of truth. So what it is we judge the truth of a claim against, or another might be to, as you bring up, to challenge the like extent to which we ought to submit to truth. So like to challenge a particular regime. And then the third might be to challenge the extent to which particular truths demand particular specified and sort of determined submissions in terms of what we believe are practical consequences. So you might say like sort of more towards the third option, like seeing that the sky is blue, I might say, I might accept the belief as a practical consequence that the sky is blue, or I might accept the belief that the sky is not the color of the grass. And it seems that these are two different practical consequences that issue from the same game of truth. And it seems like the terrain of political debate might operate either on the game of truth or on the kinds of practical consequences that issue from particular settled truth claims. And I'm just curious which of the two, or maybe both,
Yeah,
to look
thanks
for.
the question. I mean, I think the first piece of that, where it's focused on the games of truth, this is, I mean, Lorenzini's book, Daniele Lorenzini was here last quarter, and he wrote a book called The Force of Truth, which is on genealogy and truth-telling, and the work of Michel Foucault, which I draw on in this book. So just a little background there. And he focuses on a shift in Foucault's thinking about truth, because the earlier Foucault, is really interested in these like games of truth and focused on that. And so then, people read him as questioning that truth, that there are, that a game of truth actually is where truth lies, as if it's all just, about power, right? That's why I was saying that thing about it's not just about power for Foucault. Because I'm just adding this. So, I mean, it's not that Foucault is questioning that, what is true is given in a game of truth. A game of truth has the criteria for determining what is true and what is false. So it's like either you're in that language game or you're not in that language game. If you're in that language game, then certain things would have to, sort of follow if you apply the criteria correctly. Obviously, this is all based on a certain understanding of rule following, which I'm definitely not going to get into now. But then he moves in his later work to those other two sort of things, which is more, he discovers, well, wait a minute, it doesn't necessarily mean that if I say something is true, that I have to then implement the practical consequences that follow from that. So where does that come from? And even to talk about truth as a regime sounds strange, because truth isn't a regime. Truth is just, there's not power in truth. That's not the normal way we think about truth. So that's where his attention goes. And I think that I mean, in the book, you know, I always try to play Arendt and Foucault off each other with Wittgenstein in there messing everything up, you know, because I think that there are times when Foucault loses track of how certain games of truth are, you know, certain ways of responding to certain games of truth. First of all, the games of truth themselves, and certain ways of responding to them are part of a larger, you know, a larger socio-historical context, like, for example, totalitarianism, you know, that Arendt discusses. So I don't, you know, sometimes I'm dissatisfied with the way in which Foucault returns to that question of the game of truth. But intrinsically, he wants to question, you know, that these games are just what they are and we should just follow them, and that's the basic point, really. Did that get your question?
Yeah, I guess about whether, like, the sort of practice of Parisian, or the democratic elements of the democratic theory elements of the book locate politics in in that like intrinsic Foucauldian questioning the games of truth space, or if they locate it in the questioning the practical consequences from
Okay.
particular truth.
Yeah. Okay, then I wasn't clear, because this distinction between a game of truth and a regime of truth, i.e. the, you know, epistemic sort of, you know, something is true or not, right? And then, okay, so it's true, then what do I do with that? The practical consequences of affirming that it's true, that comes from Foucault. That's straight out of Foucault. That's his, you know, that's his later work. So it's not that he stays focused just on the game of truth. Really, what he's really interested in the later work are these regimes of truth and how they are connected with power. And as he puts it, I read that one passage where he says, well, why is it that, you know, subjects in a particular political regime have to manifest the truth of that regime? You know, I mean, why do they have to? I mean, you think about somebody like Hobbes, right, who's sort of whatever's going on in your head, that's not really that interesting for him. But you need to manifest, you need to show publicly that, you know, the Leviathan is, you know, the boss, right? I mean, it's like this thing about why do we have to manifest these truths, you know? That's really, and that gets really directly into issues of power.
Thank you so much, Linda. It was invigorating, and I can't wait to read the book. I want to go back to this one formulation of the lie as a boundless action, which I thought was very interesting, sort of how the lie, you know, is an action, but it sort of becomes a process, which then is no longer, which sort of unravels the conditions of action. And I was reminded and sort of struck by the fact that this is basically the same formulation that Arendt uses with regards to certain forms of science. Right, so like nuclear science is also the kind of science that kind of like undoes the conditions for its own undoing, so to speak. It's this kind of boundless thing that basically unravels the world. And, you know, you offer a very powerful account of sort of how to think about the conditions for truth as a worldly, you know, caring for the truth as a worldly practice, so as to not fall into this boundless action of the lie. But I wanted to sort of invite you to think a little bit about the category of science. Whether there might be ways, so, you know, obviously there's some people in the room maybe even who might think, aren't there some problems like a pandemic or something, where, you know, we're sort of hit with the kind of like the brute force of you know, Cartesianism, so to speak, where we do want the Cartesian concept of truth to govern our affairs. So we do want to return to this kind of scientific concept of a factual truth and disregard all the problems that come with it that Arendt identifies. And so if we buy into the Arendtian critique of the corrosive effects of this Cartesian tradition, of a sort of subjectivism and the worldlessness of that kind of science, even though we also in some moments of emergency might rely on that science, wouldn't we also have to rethink the way science and scientific expertise, and maybe not just truth but knowledge, relates to this worldly space that needs to be maintained? And so I guess what I thought was sort of absent from the conversation is the way in which truth relates to the necessity of knowledge claims, especially when confronted with problems that really do seem like technical problems.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nicholas. Yeah, I mean, and, I agree. I mean, I agree in the sense also that I think what would be Arendt's response? I mean, my response, based on how I read Arendt, is just that it's the capacity to make political judgments, and that if you just treat truth as sacrosanct, right, and so like science is truth, then that's just scientism. And so, I mean, it's just this idea science has the answers to everything. And that's precisely what you would want us to question. But that does not mean that there are times, lots of times, when science has the right answers and we should be listening to that. So it's like, well, what do we do with those truths? You see, that's the question, okay? It's like, what do you do with them? Yeah, Lisa.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated the provocation to think less about the liar and more about the lie. I thought that was really very interesting. And I wonder, though, and I'm thinking aloud here, what might be lost in doing that as well. But I'm thinking in particular about, the kind of Lacanian reading of Trump where there's the identification with his freedom to lie.
Right.
And how that might also explain some of the attraction of Trump. Less his person, but as a phenomenon. But that does require us to also think about the work the liar is doing with the lie. And I wonder whether we want to throw out that baby with the bathwater.
No, that's a really good point, Lisa. Thank you. Yeah, I definitely don't want to, and I find that kind of analysis really fascinating. I think my own, probably where this, so yes, we shouldn't lose track of that. We should still be focused on that, particularly the affective dimensions of the lie. Like, why is that so, I don't know, mesmerizing? Like, why do people like to watch him? It's not like they're thinking, he's going to get caught in a lie, or maybe it's well, maybe he'll get caught, so it becomes like a TV show. I mean, it's just, but there's a certain excitement in watching him lie. And so I think all of that's very important. I think my focus here was really on what does it mean to think about the lie as a form of action, right? That was really the thing. And that at a certain point, what drove a lot of this book was my own exhaustion with fact checking. I am a devoted fact checker. It just never stops. And, and so, but this sense of, well, what are you not getting at? Okay, and so the fact-checking part, like we caught him. I mean, as we all know, those of you who you were all around, you're old enough, around for the first Trump regime, we had the list in the New York Times and the Washington Post of a kind of ongoing, Trump's lies, right? So every day you would wake up and read, and it's how many thousands is it today kind of thing. It was like the national debt, you know what I mean? You'd sort of like watch it just clicking around. And, and you just get to this point where you think, okay, they've caught him in all these lies, but, clearly this is not, he's still gonna get elected. He did get elected, well, he did get elected this time. So, understanding, like I use this example of the Springfield, Ohio lies about the Haitian immigrants, right? Remember that one? That was J.D. Vance talking about them stealing people's, pets, their cats and dogs, and roasting them and eating them. And so this is like 15,000 Haitian immigrants in a small town. So, and most of them are citizens, as it turns out, right? But the point is that even though this was all fact-checked, they're not, it's absurd to think you have to even fact-check it, but it was fact-checked that, they weren't actually eating, whatever Snoopy next door kind of thing. But still the point is that, and this is a point that was made by someone in a piece that I read, of just this thing of going that far already sort of puts them outside the realm of the human, right? So that they then become so alien that they really can just be shipped off. They're lucky if they're shipped off to Guantanamo or El Salvador, right? That's the good fate for them. And so there's a way in which that then spreads over this just generalized idea of what it means to be an immigrant in America, a migrant or whatever. And so it's not a matter of like, yes, it was fact-checked, yes, it seemed to be ridiculous, but the lie kind of takes on its own life, you know, and it infuses then even more life into these anti-immigrant, you know, sort of ideologies. So, yeah, so that's what I was interested in.
Thank you.
Omar, yeah, sorry. There you go.
Hi. Thank you for this lovely talk. So I think my question kind of complements Nicholas as well, but comes at it from the angle of faith instead of science, right? So what I took you to be saying is that the post-truth debate is...
Talk a little louder.
Yeah. I don't think this is working. It's just for recording. Oh, okay. That the post-truth debate is kind of insisting that, how do I say? That the problem isn't that we take the lie to be true and the truth to be a lie. It's that this kind of, the conditions of post-truth are actually attacking the capacity to distinguish between what is true and what is false in the first place. Okay. But I guess I wonder like how we can use your account then to make sense of the rise of religious fundamentalisms around the world that are insisting on not only like objective scientific truths, but truths that are beyond the human political realm, right? And here I think about like, you know, obviously homophobic, anti-gender, transphobic mobilization around the world that's insisting on a natural fact of two genders and a hierarchical relation between them, right? So in a way, like, how do these conditions that you're delineating in your account also, you know, serve as a kind of ecology for the turn toward faith? Is faith another kind of desire? Is this insistence on faith another like insistence on objectivity? Is it different? So that's the question.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question, and I think it definitely is connected up with anti-gender ideology, no question, you know, where once again, you know, you've got a lot of fact-checking going on, a lot of fact-checking of the claims that are made by anti-gender ideologists, and you know, you just keep coming up against a wall because, you know, I think, I'll get to the faith thing in just a sec, but I think what's interesting is it isn't just losing the capacity to tell the difference between true or false, right? That's a very important aspect of Arendt's argument. But there's something else, which is probably closer to the sort of people who make this analysis of that we're actually just in this stage of like bullshit, you know, this concept that people are attracted actually to the kind of perlocutionary force of someone lying in public where everyone knows it's a lie. So there's that going on. And I guess the way I would put that then is a kind of not just inability to tell the difference between a true or false, but an indifference, just an absolute indifference. That's very corrosive, you know. And now, I mean, with faith, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly how to answer that because, yeah, I mean, belief in God is not based on proof, right? I mean, there are parts of religions that do try to make that argument, you know, the historical Jesus and so on. But there is a rise in religiosity in this country, a significant rise of religiosity, although I'm talking about in the United States now, but it's not connected up with organized religion. So I mean, if you have an answer and you want to, okay. Thank you. Jennifer.
Thank you. I have a question. I'm sitting next to Lisa, so it's I'll just channel Lisa's, you know, first book and thinking about the ways in which powerful figures use the ability to get others around them to lie as a way of demonstrating their power over. I mean, I'm going to mangle the argument, but and you were talking about ordinary citizens and kind of lack of trust in ordinary citizens to make judgments, but in this case, it seems like, you know, it's the middle echelons of the powerful whose performance of obeisance by repeating lies that everybody knows to be lies. I mean, it's it's adjacent to the bullshit thing, but it's a bit different, I think, and I just wonder how that aspect of lying as power plays into the way you're thinking about it.
Well,
Sorry.
I mean, I think it's very, did she get your argument right, Lisa?
It's a kind of sycophantism that's generated by the enforcement of the fiction where everyone knows they're lying and
Yeah.
it doesn't matter because what they're acting as if this is the truth, thereby helping
Right.
to produce a reality.
Right. No, that's clearly going on. I mean, I'm not in any way trying to deny that. So that's another reason for not losing track of the liars themselves, and the kinds of performances that they engage in. But it's also a way of, that is also a way in which a lie is a form of action, because it's not that they just repeat the lie verbatim. They add things to it. Right? So, at a certain point, Trump just to take Trump, he loses control over the lie. The lie then gets picked up by these sycophants, or whatever you want to call them, these people who are around him. And then they start adding all this stuff to it. And so nobody's really in control of the lie anymore. That's kind of the thing. I think you can put those two things together. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your talk and kind of jumping off some of the few people who have asked questions before. I'm really interested, you mentioned this idea of Hannah Arendt bringing up this idea that approaching truth as a binary is maybe not the best approach. And I was struck at the end of your argument with this idea, I think it wasn't Foucault himself, but someone writing about Foucault kind of talking about how in any game of truth there are actually multiple outcomes. And I'm kind of curious what you think the sort of like dialectical effect of that is. Is there a way to escape the binary of truth kind of through these arrangements that actually produce more than just it is true or it is not true? Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. So I was talking about the binary conception of truth. Either a proposition is true or it's not. And I mean, Foucault is not arguing that the game of truth has multiple truths, right? So the game of truth this is why he's not a wild postmodernist or a post-truth person or something. I mean, he's got, the game of truth has certain criteria, and certain things are going to be true if you apply those criteria correctly. So he agrees with that. It does, however, have, if this was maybe your point, possible different regimes of truth, right? That is, I could take that truth that belongs to the game and act on it in a variety of different ways. That's really the point he wants to bring out. Whereas we're locked into thinking that once you accept it's true, only one thing follows from that. So he's trying to get us to see, well, you could react in different ways, which doesn't mean saying it's not true, although maybe you'd say that because you would be questioning, let's get back to Eli's question, maybe you would be questioning the game of truth itself as somehow, you could take the case of gender dysphoria, like, well, what are those criteria? Why should I believe those criteria? So you could go drill down into the game. But it's also about, even games of truth that you might accept. You might just not follow where it supposedly should lead you, or different people will follow different paths. That's what he's trying to open up. Does that get to you? Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Yes, hi, I'll get to you.
Hi, thank you very much. So first question is just two quick questions. The first one is, what's new about this alleged truth crisis that was not present in Arendt or Foucault time? So do you think, at the risk of being sort of chronocentric, do you think that this sort of radical epistemic egalitarianism inaugurated with the internet and social media has anything to do with it? And the second question is, what's inherently problematic about alternative facts, fake news, and post-truth for democracy? So if we take a minimalist understanding of democracy, is about choosing our rulers in free and fair elections, and we have the right to choose rulers who ignore or defy established scientific facts. Actually, you just did it. Argentinians did it Brazilians did it in climate change and vaccination and stuff like that. So that might be very bad for many outcomes, but it's not clear to me why it endangers democracy in this sort of minimalistic understanding.
The minimalistic understanding of like why, are you asking the question? So are you asking the question of like why would, I mean, I'm not using the diagnosis of post-truth, I'm trying to distance myself from it, but let's take these categories of like, you know, alternative facts, lies, okay, why is that?
Why are problematic for democracy? There's so many groups saying why identity politics is going to endanger democracy, why in this case, this alleged truth crisis would endanger democracy in this minimalistic sense, unless you want to put an adjective to democracy, like epistemic democracy or deliberative democracy or something like that. Are you sort of endorsing one of these adjectives, these last names of democracy, or are you thinking in this sort of minimalistic electoral or procedural way, if you want?
Well, I'm definitely not thinking in this minimalistic electoral way. I'm probably thinking, I am thinking about democracy more along the lines of someone like Hannah Arendt, for whom it's not just about, you know, having the chance to vote, okay, and, you know, electing a leader. So, no, it's not, you know, at a minimal level, but even at a minimal level, right? Maybe it turns out that you thought you were voting for someone who was going to do X, but then they don't even do X because they were lying about it all along, right? Or that's what I think is happening right now to a lot of people who voted for Trump. They're sort of, wait a minute, he said he was going to do X, but he's not doing X, you know? So there's buyer's remorse, let's call it that. And so I do think that matters as well. But also it matters because I think it generates a kind of, I don't know, just atmosphere of suspicion towards sort of everything that everyone says, including your own fellow citizens.
So, thank you for being here and having this discussion. This ontology of truth that you speak about is sort of like a Western Eurocentric concept of truth. And it sort of reinforces this idea of democracy, which is in practice unstable, like has an unstable foundation. And so I'm wondering about there's two main concerns that it sort of amplifies. And that is, the first one is is the Socratic critique of democracy, that the voices of the majority could devolve into tyranny and populism, and that with the power being placed on delegates has not altered that. And I think that's evident in this election. And then the second thing is that there are populations that are disenfranchised from the political process, and have been so for a long time. So this idea of democracy, that the truth and democracy are a strange, I don't know, they fit so well together, because
you don't know whether they do or whether they don't.
Well, democracy is sort of an ideal. It's a sort of a fantasy that, it's spoken of in a sense of a fantasy. But if you look at the definition of democracy, it's the voices of the majority, which can displace so many people. So it's not democratic in the sense that we think of democracy as being representative of the people. And then the concept of truth is that the concept of truth as being an objective truth, that there is an objective truth. It's also it's a Western idea, I think, that there is one objective truth because of like what you were saying earlier, the pluralism. I don't know if you were referring to Arendt, this pluralist idea that, it was Arendt. that we have the world in common so long as we see it from different perspectives. So in that sense, yeah, what is truth? I don't know. It's just some things to think about.
Well, I'm definitely not going to answer that question, but I'm clearly not, hopefully we're on the same page, I'm not making an argument for objective truth. And as far as Socrates goes, Socrates may have said a lot of things that, but Socrates also said there's truth in opinion. There's truth in opinion. And that's why he is, for Arendt, like the hero, of this whole sort of situation in 5th century Athens, because she really sees him as someone who understands the role of opinion in the formation of truth. So whether it's a Western idea or not, probably, maybe it is, but I'm really not, I'm not defending that idea of truth. Okay, was there another part of your question that I didn't?
I'm just thinking about in terms of we're talking about democracy and the things that are going on now, things that are being said and the lies and all this. Evasion has been part of the political process for a long time, and certain segments of the population have felt that, more than others. And what makes us think that as long as there is injustice, that we are safe? I mean, as long as people are disenfranchised from the political process, racially, we're immune.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, yes, of course. And I think, look, I think that there's one way of looking at this is the way in which, for example, populism and democracy kind of get run into each other, right? So now we have this whole language of, anti-populism, et cetera, which really sort of morphs at a certain point into a defense of epistocracy, and essentially the idea that ordinary citizens, if you just let them really exercise their rights, it's almost like going back to Samuel Huntington's argument back in response to the protests in the Vietnam War. Like if they actually exercise their rights to protest, et cetera, then we're going to have total chaos. And so, I think we have to be careful, one, not to get dragged into arguments against populism that are really just kind of code for arguments against democracy and democratic participation. I think that's very important. But in terms of, majority, that's why we have, I'm not here to defend liberal democracy, so don't worry, but I mean, there's like a lot of aspects of liberal democracy that are very important, and one is this issue of, protection of minorities, so rights. I mean, so I don't, that's all I'm going to say on that.
Thank you. This feels like such a generative talk, and also I'm excited to read the book. And so one question that I was thinking, both during your talk, but also I think during the Q&A, is for Arendt, the kind of loss of truth that she's tracing in Origins, but also in Truth and Politics and elsewhere, is a philosophic argument, but it's also a historical and a sociological one. And one of the things when you mentioned lying in, like her work, Lying in Politics, it seems like there's a real distinction between lying in politics in the 1970s, which there was not the kind of mass desire for it as there is now. And so I'm curious, to what extent does the book, or do you think about the ways in which the kind of the affective desires for lying have changed, and what are the either socio-historical or socio-political processes in the United States that are situating the kind of impulse to abandon the world as it is, or kind of to jump into disorientation in the ways that you're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, kind of. Yine. I mean, I sort of do. I don't really go into, it's not, a sort of historical, but I do in chapter 3, which is really a chapter on fact checking and her reading of the Pentagon Papers and So there I do a little bit of that. But no, you're right. I mean, a more, let's say, sociological approach would have been to look, socio-political approach would have been to look at, how lying has changed over time. And, some people say, well, hey, it's not that different today. People have always lied, et cetera. But what I find interesting in Arendt is she really is trying to understand how the lie itself, like what is the difference between the traditional lie and the modern lie, right? And she shows that very clearly, I think, in the case of the Pentagon Papers, where, like the image becomes reality. And then the reality, which is actually being produced by the people working for the government, like giving them the facts, is just dismissed because everything is in the service of the image. So, of victory, right? So, yeah. I'd like to say that's the next book, but it's not. I'm done with truth, okay? So, thank you.